guys! I am so excited to begin this story with you. This book is The Secret Garden, and it's a mystery story with a deep, dark secret and a big mansion off in the middle of nowhere with an arrival in the dark of the night and 100 rooms that have never been used. And it's also a story about a girl who is not a very nice person learning to be better. And it's the story of a garden and the magic of things growing and coming to life. Some context for the beginning of this story. Mary Lennox is living in India, the country of India, in the 1800s. Now, at this point, India has been colonized, that means sort of taken over, by England, by the British. Just like back in the 1700s, the British, or England, sort of took over or owned the United States, and we had to kind of fight to get our freedom. At this point, England owns or has taken over India. So there's some kind of unpleasant, a little bit racist undertones to some of the pieces of this story. And I think it's important to understand that context, to understand the attitude. That British at this point kind of thought they could just walk in anywhere and take over the country, which of course is probably not the right thing to do, as we've learned since. But just to kind of give you some context. So Mary is a little girl who is British. She's from England. Her parents are British from England, but they are living in India at the beginning of the story. And as you can see, they're not particularly thoughtful or kind to the people who live there. But that's really also part of Mary's story. She's not particularly thoughtful or kind to anyone at the beginning of this story. So I will get started. Chapter 1 is called There's No One Left. When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. It was true, too. She had a thin little face and a thin little body, thin light hair, and a sour expression. Her hair was yellow and her face was yellow because she had been born in India and had always been ill in one way or another. Her father had held a position under the English government and had always been busy and ill himself. And her mother had been a great beauty who cared only to go to parties and amuse herself with happy people. She had not wanted a little girl at all, and when Mary was born, she was handed her over to the care of an ayah, who was made to understand, an ayah is kind of like a nanny, who was made to understand that if she wished to please the Mem Sahib, she must keep the child out of sight as much as possible. So when she was a sickly, fretful, ugly little baby, she was kept out of the way. And when she became a sickly, fretful, toddling little thing, she was kept out of the way also. She never remembered seeing familiarly anything but the faces of her ayah and the other servants. And as they always obeyed her and gave her her own way in everything, because the Mem Sahib would be angry if she was disturbed by her crying, by the time Mary was 6 years old, she was as tyrannical and selfish a little pig as ever lived. The young English governess who came to teach her to read and write disliked her so much that she gave up her place in 3 months. And when other governesses came to try and fill it, they always went away in a shorter time than the first one. So if Mary had not chosen to really want to know how to read books, she would never have learned her letters at all. One frightfully hot morning, when she was about 9 years old, she awakened feeling very cross, and became crosser still when she saw the servant who stood by her bedside was not her ayah. "Why did you come?" she said to the strange woman. "I will not let you stay. Send my ayah to me." The woman looked frightened, but she only stammered that the ayah could not come, and when Mary threw herself into a passion and beat and kicked her, she looked only more frightened and repeated that it was not possible for the ayah to come. There was something mysterious in the air that morning. Nothing was done in its regular order, and several of the servants seemed missing, while those whom Mary saw slunk or hurried about with ashy and scared faces. But no one would tell her anything, and her ayah did not come. She was actually left alone as the morning went on, and at last she wandered out into the garden and began to play by herself under a tree near the veranda. She pretended that she was making a flower bed, and she stuck a big scarlet hibiscus blossom into little heaps of earth, all the time growing more and more angry and muttering to herself all the things she would say and the names she would call Sadie when she returned. "Pig! Pig! Daughter of Pig!" she said, because to call someone a pig is the worst insult of all. She was grinding her teeth and saying this over and over again when she heard her mother come out on the veranda with someone. She was with a fair young man, and they stood together talking in low, strange voices. Mary knew the fair young man who looked like a boy. She had heard that he was a very young officer who had just come from England. The child stared at him, but she stared most at her mother. She always did this when she had a chance to see her, because the Mem Sahib, Mary used to call her that oftener than anything else, was such a tall, slim, pretty person and wore such lovely clothes. Her hair was like curly silk, and she had a delicate little nose which always seemed to be disdaining things, and she had large, laughing eyes. All her clothes were thin and floating, and Mary said they were full of lace. They looked fuller of lace than ever this morning, but her eyes were not laughing at all. They were large and scared, and lifted imploringly to the fair boy officer's face. "Oh, is it so very bad? Is it?" Mary heard her say. "Awfully," the young man answered in a trembling voice. "Awfully, Mrs. Lennox. You ought to have gone to the hills 2 weeks ago." The Mem Sahib wrung her hands. "Oh, I know I ought," she cried. "I only stayed to go to that silly dinner party. What a fool I was." At that very moment, such a loud wailing broke out from the servants' quarters that she clutched the young man's arm, and Mary stood shivering from head to foot. The wailing grew wilder and wilder. "What is it? What is it?" Mrs. Lennox gasped. "Someone has died," answered the boy officer. "You did not say it had broken out among your servants." "I did not know," the Mem Sahib cried. "Come with me," and she turned and ran into the house. After that, appalling things happened, and the mysteriousness of the morning was explained to Mary. Cholera had broken out in its most deadly form, and people were dying like flies. So, some context for this. Cholera, way before COVID-19, was a pandemic that hit many places in the world. And unlike COVID-19, if you got cholera, there was no hospital, there was no treatment, and you were usually dead within 24 to 48 hours. So, pretty scary pandemic. The ayah had just taken ill in the night, and it was because she had just died that the servants wailed in their huts. Before the next day, 3 other servants were dead, and others had run off in terror. There was panic on every side, and dying people in the bungalows. During the confusion and the bewilderment of the second day, Mary hid herself in the nursery and was forgotten by everyone. Nobody thought of her. Nobody wanted her. And strange things happened of which she knew nothing. Mary cried and slept through the hours. She only knew that people were ill, and that she heard mysterious and frightening sounds. Once she crept into the dining room and found it empty, though a partially finished meal was on the table, and chairs and plates looked as if they had been hastily pushed back when the diners rose and suddenly for some reason. The child ate some fruit and biscuits, and being thirsty, she drank a glass of wine which stood nearly filled. It was sweet, and she did not know how strong it was. Very soon it made her intensely drowsy, and she went back to her nursery and shut herself in again. Frightened by the cries she heard in the huts and the hurrying sound of feet. Now this is very important to the story, because while everyone else is panicking and sort of infecting each other with cholera, Mary has shut herself into this little corner. The wine made her sleepy, so she could scarcely keep her eyes open, and she lay down on her bed and knew nothing more for a long time. And that is where we will leave Miss Mary today. So join me tomorrow to see if she survives and what happens next.